We are on Chapter 2 of the History of Mathematics. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit and we'll do full screen. Okay, Chapter 2. The historic period down to 1000 BC. General view. Sources of our knowledge. The period down to the arbitrarily selected date 1000 BC overlaps the prehistoric period mentioned in Chapter 1. The prehistoric gradually merging into the historic in certain parts of the world, but not reaching this stage in certain other parts. Various facts, which might properly have found place in Chapter 1, will therefore be related in this chapter. But in a general way, we shall now pass to that period and the evolution of the race in which less use need be made of conjecture in the recital of the story of mathematics, although it cannot be wholly eliminated. The sources of our knowledge are no longer mere tradition, nor does inference from the study of savage tribes constitute so important a basis for our statements. The sources are now, in general, the relics of human activity, largely in the form of inscriptions or manuscripts, which actually date from remote centuries, or of copies of such evidences. Inscriptions or manuscripts. Countries considered. There are 4 countries which have left to posterity such an abundance of historical material prior to the beginning of the first millennium of the pre-Christian era as to warrant our special consideration. These countries, considered geographically instead of politically, are Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, and India. Each claims for itself a high degree of antiquity. Each claims to have been a pioneer in mathematical development. Each is an ethnographically somewhat of a unit, and in certain respects the claims of each have reasonable foundations. Each had, at least in considerable areas, a salubrious climate in the warm intervals between the several descents of the ice from the north, descents which characterize what is commonly called the glacial epoch, and hence each was able to, just want to make sure something, okay, page 20, 21, was commonly called the glacial epochs, and hence each was able to develop an early civilization. Each flourished along one or more important rivers, which not only furnished water for navigation and for domestic purposes, but also afforded opportunities for the application of a rude form of mathematics to the irrigation projects, which were already in evidence in the early centuries of the historic period. From each, after the ice retreated, a human stream in due time flowed to the more invigorating climate of the north and carried along with it traces of the early mathematical lore which had already begun to develop in the temples, and to the customs established among the primitive traders of the more favored lands. Antiquity of Mathematics. Although there is evidence showing that the human race has been on the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, the earliest definite remains that have come down to us are from the early Stone Age, a Paleolithic age, which seems to have begun in the warm interval after the third descent of the ice. This was not less than 5,000 years before our era, and may have been from 50,000 to 70,000 years earlier still. In the remains of this period, we find implements which suggest the existence of barter and the need of numbers for counting. Although they date from a period thousands of years before there had dawned upon human intelligence any idea of written numerals, we may simply suppose that the presence of such implements and the important discovery of a means for making fire, which seemed to have occurred about 50,000 years ago, are evidence of a degree of intelligence high enough to assume idea of number. About 15,000 years before our era, there is thought to have begun the Middle Stone Age, the period of the fourth descent of the ice. In this period, we find the oldest known works of art. These works show us an intellectual advance as to make it quite certain that the world had reached a period when the abstract notion of number must have been in evidence, a judgment warranted by our knowledge of all primitive peoples today who have reached this stage in art. The Late Stone Age is relatively a recent period, dating from c. 5000 BC, and by this time there had developed quite elaborate number systems, and the observation of the stars had become a fairly well organized science. That this was the case we know from various historical facts which will be mentioned later. The advent of writing. Metal, as distinguished from natural ore, was discovered c. 4000 BC, possibly in Sinai Peninsula, and with this there came a new need for weighing and measuring, and a new impetus to a system of barter which was doubtless very old even at that time. About 500 years later, writing is known to have been in use, and the system of ruling over masses of people had become so advanced as to render possible control of a population of several millions by one government. The bearing of all of this upon the development of a number system and upon the systematic taxation is apparent. About 3000 BC, the earliest stone masonry was laid. Seagoing ships began to cross the Mediterranean, and a little later, the pyramids of Egypt were erected, so that history now enters a period in which mathematics reached out beyond mere counting and into such fields as that of practical geometry, including a primitive kind of leveling and surveying. We'll end video 5. We'll end there. Quick time. History.